Welcome to Holmes Bible College Online, our Christian Ethics course, Lesson 4 and Video 2. We are considering why, at this particular point, why the Christian worldview collides so acrimoniously with the secular worldview and why it generates so much heat and so much argumentation. There is a clash going on in American society right now and in American culture over ethics and worldviews, particularly traditional Judeo-Christian ethics and how they impact our culture or should be allowed to impact our culture. And this collision is not pretty. It's ugly. It's become extremely ugly. But the problem that Christians have, the problem that the church is having right now, is understanding why that collision is so ugly. What is going on? What shifts are taking place in the American culture that make it such an acrimonious collision and so difficult? And why is it generating so much heat, so much violence, and so much argumentation? Why is the secular worldview so closed and so dead set against accepting any traditional moral values? And why are we on the Christian side of it, the Christian ethical moral side of it, the Christian worldview, why are we so intransigent and will not analyze and look at with any sense of sympathy or careful examination the secular worldview? I think I know as a Christian that our fear is that if we're not careful, we will compromise our own spiritual values and our own moral values if we examine the reasons why there are problems that come, why there is a problem with the secular worldview and the way it intersects with the Christian worldview. We're afraid that if we even give it some consideration or examination, that somehow we will find that we are drifting into that worldview and we will accept some of its premises and we will become, as the church used to say, more worldly. Well, the church is becoming more worldly anyway, in many respects. And we have to accept the fact that the church is not where it used to be as far as its moral values are concerned, its ethical values are concerned, and even its pragmatic values, the way it practices its faith in the public square. The church has changed. There are a few holdouts who are pursuing some of the older models of Christian ethics and the way the Christian world relates to the secular world, but for the most part, the church has shifted. Some of it has been helpful, and a great deal of it has been unhelpful. And so we have to understand why we are feeling this tension. And that's the point. We want to understand why we feel the tension between the Christian worldview and the secular worldview, and why we just don't, as Christians, ignore it altogether. Now, the reason we can't ignore it altogether is if we're going to preach the gospel, we have to deal with the way the world looks at life and the universe. It is basically materialistic, it is secular, it is often not moralistic in the same way as the Christian worldview is. And so when we're preaching the gospel, we run into certain problems that we have to understand. And we talked about that in our last lesson, last video in video 1, where we talked about how different the Christian worldview is with respect to truth and the secular worldview with respect to truth. And we said that our views of truth impact two other critical areas that seem to be at the center of why the clash is so acrimonious and difficult between these two worldviews. And so those two things that we talked about were judgmentalism and social justice, or often called just justice. So let's look at this together then, first of all. Let's talk about for a few moments this idea of judgmentalism. Now, I don't know if you've heard that terminology before or if you heard anybody speak about these things before, but I think it's very important because we sometimes hear it from the world, the secular worldview, on the television. We hear it in the news. We read it in the newspapers. The mainstream media accuses the church of being judgmental. And most of the time we hear this charge made in terms of tolerance. All right? Or more often in terms of intolerance. The idea that the Christian worldview, with its strong moral ethic, is intolerant of other worldviews. In other words, the Christian worldview leaves no room, no wriggle room, morally speaking, for any other view because of its strong, hard moral and ethical stance on issues and conduct and character. And so the world, the secular worldview accuses the Christian community and those who hold the Christian ethical moral worldview of intolerance. That's the most that is most frequently the way that this is portrayed or brought out. Judgmentalism, then, is the idea that one group or another passes moral judgment or has an attitude or spirit of moral judgment against another group of people or person based on behavior, conduct, character, and moral values. So if you've got one group that passes judgment on another group, it can be said that the group passing judgment or making evaluations, moral evaluations of another group is judgmental. That is, it is passing moral judgment on that group and condemning it for those moral shortcomings, or what it sees as moral shortcomings. So when we talk about judgmentalism, we are talking about one group judging another group by moral principles and rules that it lives by, that the other group does not appear to live by or adhere to. And that group judges this group as being uncompliant with those moral rules by which it lives, and therefore this group is morally wrong, or as the world looks at it, is considered to be morally inferior. And that is the key to this judgmentalism debate. The idea that one group considers another group to be inferior. That is, inferior morally. And if a group considers another group to be inferior morally, then it follows from the reasoning that the secular worldview applies to this, that they see this other group as being humanly inferior. That is, of less value than those who adhere to whatever principles it is by which they're judging everybody else. Now, this is particularly applied to Christians. This idea that Christians look at everyone else from their own moral standpoint and from their own moral value and ethical system as being inferior to them because they judge people's behavior, conduct, character by the standards of their Christian moral system. So is there any way that we can kind of get is there some sort of a practical way we can wrap our minds around this so we can see how this works? Yes, I think there is. I think we have a very good picture of this idea in the Gospels, where Jesus had a constant battle with a group of people called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were originally a group of fundamentalist Jews who wanted to return to the holiness and the righteousness of the law after Israel's moral failure that led to exile and captivity in Babylon. And for the most part, they led the nation back into compliance to the will of God and to the holiness and the righteousness that God required of his people. That was their goal and their purpose. As the group developed and things went forward several centuries into the days of Jesus' arrival and Jesus' ministry, the Pharisees had become a group that were extremely religious. And not only religious, they had become very legalistic. Their adherence to the law and what was called the tradition of the elders, which was the interpretation of how the law had to be applied, became very, very rigorous. And that rigorous application of the law came down to even minutiae of descriptions of what you could and could not do under all kinds of circumstances of what we would think of as ordinary life. So you could break the law, as it were, you could break the ethical code in some very innocuous ways, or even going about your regular business, you would find yourself in contravention of the tradition and the codes. But the Pharisees made it their business, the religious group of Pharisaical disciples, made it their business to keep the minutiae of the law in every aspect of it that they possibly could. And so they appeared to most people to be extremely superior in their adherence to the law, and therefore were considered to be righteous and holy above other people, generally speaking. In fact, it was such that in Jesus' day, keeping the law according to the tradition of the elders and the religious moral, the ethical and religious standards and moral standards of the Pharisees and of that day was pretty much impossible for a man or a woman or a family that were trying to make a living. Very, very difficult to live in an ordinary life in Palestine at that particular time and make a living and live normally and still be able to keep all of these rules. So the Pharisees tended to look down on all of the people and considered them to be beneath them morally and spiritually, and also in some respects to treat them or to regard them with contempt. This is the idea, this is the kind of idea that the secular worldview has of Christian morality. That when Christians speak of moral principles and ethical standards, especially biblical ones, the secular world looks at it as though Christians have a contemptuous attitude towards those who are not living by those principles. Christians are not only regard themselves to be superior, but they regard everyone else to be inferior, not just morally inferior, but inferior in character, inferior in their conduct, and therefore inferior in the value of their humanity, because they're not living up to this standard. So that's the clash that we see in judgmentalism. If we don't understand that that's what's driving the agenda of tolerance and intolerance in American culture, then we're going to have a problem understanding the way things are in our culture today. Now, judgmentalism implies then an evaluation of conduct and character. Judgmentalism implies a judgment of conduct and character. When we say that someone is judging another person, they are evaluating their conduct, what they do, and their character, what kind of person they are, by some sort of ethical or moral principle or standard. We would sometimes say rules. And rules do come into it, because inevitably ethics and morals sort of devolve into principles and sets of rules at some point. within groups. So the evaluation that takes place is one group is looking at the conduct of another and saying that the conduct of that group doesn't meet a certain standard. They're also looking at the character of the person. Now, we tend to judge people's character by what they do. So when we see consistent behavior that to us looks immoral and wrong and even wicked or evil or mean or inappropriate, then we judge that person's character to be flawed. There's something wrong with that person because they constantly do these kinds of things, so something must be wrong with them that makes them do those kind of things. All right? So character then is also judged or evaluated by a set of moral or ethical principles or a set of moral and ethical ideals, such as the Christian worldview or the biblical worldview. Now, that's what judgmentalism does, according to the secular worldview. It judges people and then it condemns them. It then condemns them for their moral failure, or for the failure of meeting those moral standards. So judgmentalism not only evaluates, but it condemns. And so what happens in the view of the secular world of the secular world in America and in other places, especially in our culture, the idea is that any evaluation, any judgment, any evaluation of a person's conduct or character automatically leads to condemnation. That's judgmentalism. Evaluation, even when evaluation takes place, but no condemnation is expressed, just the act of examining someone's behavior or someone's character is considered to be condemnatory and therefore judgmental. Because in the secular worldview, evaluation always leads to condemnation. Now, I need to say something here about the Christian worldview. There are two sides to the way we as Christians in our worldview deal with this idea of evaluation. We either recognize that everyone is a sinner in need of God's grace, or we are religious and we do in fact condemn others. Now, the gospel by its very nature is an evaluation of the whole human condition that says we are sinners and we need the grace of God. Therefore, the gospel does in fact warn us of there being a condemnation upon sin. And this condemnation doesn't come from people, it comes from God. So the true gospel message, and let me put that there, the true gospel message is a message that warns us of a condemnation that is upon the sinfulness of our human nature and upon us as people if we refuse to repent and turn to God. So in fact, the gospel does not only evaluate the human condition and human conduct and warn us that we are sinners, but that we are under the condemnation or the judgment of God, and something needs to happen before it's too late. That is the gospel message. But the center of the gospel message is the idea that through God's grace, God can forgive our sin. And God can change and alter not only the circumstances with respect to the condemnation that we are under because of our sin, and God can forgive us and justify us, but that God can actually, in fact, produce righteousness. So the gospel talks about how God can change our conduct and our character. And he starts by a change in our character, that is in our nature, and then through the power of the Holy Spirit and the sanctifying power of God, he changes our conduct. God addresses the problem on the inside, and then then through the power of the Holy Spirit, God addresses the conduct that comes out of the renewed and changed character. That is really, really important for us to understand. So the gospel in this sense has to do with grace. It's about grace. God changing those circumstances of condemnation. Now, this is a message we ought to be sharing with the secular world. But as Christians, we sometimes come across as being religious. And in our religiosity, we can come across as condemnatory, but without the grace. So we condemn abortion, we condemn homosexuality, we condemn transgenderism, and a whole host of other social things. We condemn it all, but we don't come across with the idea that it is only by God's grace that we can have a solution to the human problem of what's wrong with our nature and what's going on in the world today. So as the world deteriorates, our religious instinct is to become more and more condemnatory of what's happening. And this is what we do in American society. We do it and we go to our senators and we go to our leaders and we want them to change it. But actually it can't change unless the grace of God does the work. God's grace is what is critical to the change in human nature. But we are busy condemning it, and we want our legislators to change it by law. And because our legislators cannot change where American culture is going by law, then we as Christians come across as being Pharisaical in our attitudes and in the way we do things. We come across as being religious zealots and condemnatory, and therefore we are perceived as being judgmental. The gospel is not judgmentalism, the real gospel, and Jesus was never judgmental. The only people that he was steadfastly opposed to were the Pharisaical, the Pharisees, who were so condemnatory of everybody else. So it's very important for us to understand how all of this works together. Now, in what is the supreme irony then, and we need to look at this together. Make some room on the board here. I'm going to leave the word judgmentalism up so you'll know what topic we're sort of discussing right now. So there's a supreme irony in all of this. The materialist believes that there is no God. Okay, so in the secular worldview, if I can use that as the abbreviation, in the secular worldview, it is driven by materialism. That is, there is no God, no miracles. Everything is explained by materialism. All right? Now, actually, materialism falls prey to a whole host of issues and problems about how the material cosmos actually came about. And that's apologetics. We won't get into that today. But anyway, the materialist says that there is no God, there are no miracles, there's nothing but material. We are what we are, the cosmos is what it is. And when you start condemning other people, and when you start judging other people and evaluating other people morally and condemning them, you are doing something wrong. So the secular worldview says it is wrong to judge people. And in fact, they will even point to Matthew chapter 7 and verses 1 and 2, where Jesus says, don't judge or you will be judged. They even turn the Bible against the Christian worldview in order to show how it is wrong to judge. And they've actually taken it out of context. We won't do an exposition of that today. But the idea is that judgmentalism then is wrong. Since there is no God, since we're all the same, since we're all material, since we all came from the same source, since we're all equal, we're all on the same level, nobody should be judging anybody else. Everybody is equal. Everybody is the same. All human beings are the same. Therefore, it is wrong. It is morally and ethically wrong to judge other people. You cannot call another person morally unfit or morally wrong. So there is now then an ethical rule. There's an ethical principle, I should say, in the secular worldview that says it is wrong to judge. Now, I want you to get this. I want you to see this, okay? This is an irony. This is something that elevates itself to the point of self-contradiction. If you have a system, a worldview that says it is wrong to judge other people, and then you say, we don't believe that there's such a thing as moral principles. Everybody is equal. Therefore, nobody gets to judge anyone else by their own personal moral standards. And we get back to that. It's my moral standard versus your moral standard. Mine has the same value as yours. So you live by your moral principles and I'll live by my moral principles. Nobody's moral principles are better than anybody else's. And then immediately they say we're going to back that idea up by saying it is wrong to judge other people. So immediately we have an overarching absolute moral principle that says it is wrong to judge others. So in fact, the secular worldview does in fact have an overarching absolute moral principle, and it is that you cannot judge others by your moral principles. It's self-defeating. It is wrong to judge people by moral principle because we're all the same. And this is the moral principle that we're applying, which is absolute. It's wrong to judge people by moral principle. Does that make sense? Or ethical standards and principles. So what happens is it becomes self-defeating again, as many of these things that we have seen already do. The idea that there are no moral principles and that we are not allowed, it is wrong for us to judge people by ethical standards and moral principles is in itself a moral principle. Therefore, the system is incoherent and it breaks down. What happens at the heart of this idea of judgmentalism then, what the bugaboo is, what the problem is that the material worldview is seeking to overcome is let me redo this, is the devaluation, or what they see as a devaluation of humanity or of personhood. The secular worldview struggles with the idea that when you make a moral evaluation, you are devaluing somebody's personhood or humanity. Now, there's a sense in which this is not wrong. Because if we're talking, even from the Christian perspective, if we're talking about merely a religious zeal or system, then indeed there is a tendency for even Christians to look at other people and to see them as being morally inferior and therefore of lesser value. There is a value system that goes with this zeal and religiosity and piety. And we always used to say in my day, and it's probably just not current anymore, holier than thou attitude. But the truth is that holier than thou attitude is a devaluation of the other person. What the Bible makes clear is God doesn't devalue anybody. Even if a person is not morally upright, it doesn't mean that God devalues them. God cares about them. In fact, God so loved the world, the immoral world, immoral humanity, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. So God is able to separate, as it were, in his mind, the moral brokenness of humanity from the value of humanity to him, and he can still love humanity despite their moral brokenness. And so what happens here is the secular world is not able to discern that. in the church, if it is present. And sometimes in the Christian system, it is not present. That differentiation is not present. And we fail to love people and value people for what they are because of the way we perceive them morally and ethically. And that is a problem. So there's a reason why then these two worldviews come into conflict with each other. We have to, as Christians, be careful that our moral evaluations do not lead us to devalue, our immoral evaluations do not lead us to devalue personhood. But there is a inconsistency in the secular worldview that needs to really be exposed, and it is the Achilles heel of this idea of judgmentalism. And it is that there is an imported notion, I'm going to put this up here, imported notion of human value. Now, the reason that this is a supreme irony for materialism is that we are now at a stage in the development of Western thought where the value of humanity is being questioned. In fact, the value of humanity is being questioned to the extent that the value of human beings is less than the value of the environment. It's less than the value of the disappearing species that we are supposed to be responsible for eradicating. And it is less, the value of human life is less and less and less with respect to the future goals of where the cosmos doesn't think, but where the cosmos is taking the evolutionary process. Humanity is being considered as being not very important and as being devalued by materialistic science and materialistic philosophy for a very long time. Human beings actually, in the material secular worldview, human beings are not very valuable at all. And yet, when it comes to individual aspects of human life, like the idea of tolerance and judgmentalism, all of a sudden human beings are ever so valuable and nobody ought to judge them. So there is this irony and this contradiction, or what we would call incoherence. If I can spell that word while I'm still talking. Incoherence in the overall system of the secular worldview. That on the one hand, human life is valuable, but on the other hand, in different aspects of the arguments that they want to advance, that are a part of the entire secular worldview, human value is of little importance, or it's of great importance, depending what the argument is that is being made. That is incoherence. It causes the whole system of the secular worldview as a philosophy to fall under the weight of its own inconsistency, if that makes any sense. And so when you talk about being tolerant, so this leads us back to this idea of tolerance. When you talk about tolerance then and intolerance, right, then you have this situation where the people that are complaining about intolerance and saying that everybody ought to be tolerant and accept everybody else's, everybody else without judgment, that intolerance, that idea that we should accept, let me start again. I got myself tangled up. Let me start again. So the idea of tolerance and intolerance. Those who say intolerance is unacceptable, morally unacceptable, that we should treat everyone with tolerance, that is, we accept everybody where they are and who they are, regardless of what their moral conduct is or what their character is. Those people then say that those that will not, that are not tolerant, are therefore unjust and intolerant. Right? Spell it. I mean, not. Okay. I'm abbreviating because I can't get all the letters in there while I'm trying to write and talk. Okay, so unjust and intolerant. But isn't that a moral judgment? So what we have here is we have the very people that are saying we ought to be tolerant. They are now making a moral judgment about people they consider not to be tolerant, and they are therefore guilty of intolerance themselves. And therefore we have another one of these things where the whole thing goes in a circular motion and it fails. The whole system fails. So we have to understand that this idea of judgmentalism then devolves down to one thing and one thing only, and that is a moral opinion. It is not based on truth. And until we are willing to admit the idea that this is opinion and not truth, then we're going to continue to have these collisions in the public square over morals. What happens is that those who complain about judgmentalism argue their position as though their position depends upon truth. But as we can see, the position fails, or their philosophy fails and falls under the weight of its own incoherence and inconsistency. It is not based on truth. If it were based on truth, if there were a truth that they could look at and say that this is an absolute moral principle outside of ourselves and we have to adhere to it, they could make their case. But their opinion about what is just and unjust only comes from within the system itself, and therefore it fails. Okay, so I don't know if you got that, but anyway. Now, in American democracy and the struggle with Christian ethics, we have a major problem that is now confronting us in our culture, and that is that the ideas of tolerance and intolerance and judgmentalism are producing leaders and laws to support these positions. And that problem, that raises all kinds of issues, because with the inconsistencies of the foundation of these things, these attitudes, it inevitably means that what decisions are made with regard to what is moral and immoral, what is legal and illegal in the moral, ethical sphere of the secular world, means that it's going to be necessarily subjective. It is not going to be objective. And so in the future, as attitudes change, that means the laws are going to change, or we're going to have laws in place that no longer reflect the current ideas of morality. It changes. From the Christian perspective, the Word of God and our understanding of the nature of God, God's character as righteous and holy, provides us with an unchangeable and immutable standard of morals and ethics that are the same all the time, and we do not find ourselves in the untenable position of falling foul to a moral position that is no longer current, or an ethical standard and principle that is no longer current in the thinking of our culture and society. Because God's standards don't change. They are immutable. That is the difference between the two. So if we find ourselves in this position that we can't prevent a person making a moral or ethical judgment about other people, because it is then part of the way life is. Even if you are a world secularist, you are making a judgment about other people's values, moral, ethical principles and values. And therefore, you are yourself a moralist, whether you like it or not. And so what happens is we are the only question is, the question isn't whether we do make moral evaluations of one another, but the question is by what standard? And that is the question. When the two worldviews come together, it's not a question of whether we're tolerant or intolerant, or whether we're going to make these evaluations, or whether we're going to judge people by their conduct and character. That is a foregone conclusion. Human beings do it. It just happens. And it doesn't matter what your approach is, you're going to make those kind of judgments. But the question is, where do the standards come from? And who has the right to make the rules? And whose rules are we as a society, or as a group, or as a humanity, whose rules are we going to accept? So in a sense, as a secular society, we are theorists on the issue of judgmentalism. So we're theorists on the issue of judgmentalism, that nobody should judge anybody else with respect to morals and ethics. There should be absolute tolerance of all things. Now, we won't get into what tolerance means at this point. Tolerance has changed its meaning. It no longer means putting up with. It means you've got to accept and promote another person's value system. We'll get into that maybe at another time. But we're theorists. In theory, we believe, or the secular worldview believes, that everybody ought to have total freedom to live without being judged, without being evaluated in terms of their conduct and their character. But by the same token, we are pragmatists with respect to how we live this out. Because in actual fact, we do engage in moral judgment. We do engage in valuation of people's conduct and character. And the secular worldview looks at the Christian worldview and Christians and says, these people are the far right. These people are extreme right-wing terrorists. These people are morally wrong. And so there is a moral judgment that is made. So in terms of the secular worldview, and sometimes Christians fall into this trap too, there is a tension between the idea of what we want the world to be like and what the world really is like. And the two cannot be reconciled with one another, and they cannot be easily accepted or worked with. In other words, the ideas put forth by secularists and on judgmentalism, they do not work in the practical arena. They work in theory if you are willing to finesse the arguments and the philosophy and ignore the incoherence, but they cannot work in the real world, in the pragmatic world. They just don't. People just do not live like that. Now let's talk about briefly then the idea of justice. Sometimes it is called social justice, and it's important for us to understand what it is. How do you define justice then? A common notion of justice is what is fair, or the idea of equality. Those are two important notions, popular notions, of the idea of justice. The idea is that no matter how diverse society is, or people, everybody is entitled to be treated fairly and with equality. It doesn't matter whether it's social, political, racial, economic, national, religious, or whatever kind of diversity it may be. Everybody is to be treated equally. So when the question comes up, and it is asked of the Christian, for instance, should everyone be treated fairly? Well, of course we say yes. Of course they should. Christians believe that everyone ought to be treated fairly. Of course they do. So we have common ground with the secular worldview on that question. Do we mean by justice that everyone should have equal opportunity? Well, yes. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution says. It is actually been enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. It's actually been enshrined in the Declaration of Independence that human beings have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Glaringly, the Declaration doesn't talk about outcomes. It talks about the pursuit of happiness, but we'll get into that later. So justice, even in the Christian worldview, says yes, people ought to have equal opportunity. People ought not to be deprived of opportunity based on their diversity, no matter what it is. We don't treat people differently with respect to the opportunities that are available to them based on their diversity, based on being different. Then we ask the question, does that mean that everyone should be guaranteed an equal outcome? This is the question. And instinctively, most people are going to say yes. And even the Christian says, yes, the outcomes ought to be equal. Everybody is entitled to the same outcome. Everybody is entitled to the same level of results out of life. Everybody is entitled to reap the benefits equally, without regard to their diversity, their society, the kind of people they are, their politics or religion or anything else like that. Yes, we sort of say, well, yes, if everybody has the same outcome, then that is fair. There's something in our human nature that says it ought to be fair and everybody ought to have the same outcome. Now, that's an interesting idea, but it is the key idea in social justice as it is framed in our secular world today, contemporary secular world. But how does that work? How do we guarantee equal outcomes for people? Let me ask a couple of questions about this and see if we can't reason our way through it. Now then, first of all, if everybody is guaranteed equal outcomes, that means that the group, can't even get the words up here correctly. That means the group effort, and by group, we're now meaning the whole of society. The group effort means that everybody benefits equally. Now, there is a political philosophy that believes in this principle. And because it has a pejorative sound or sense in many places, you may interpret it that way when I write it on the board, but I don't want you to. I want you just to understand it in a neutral sense as a political philosophy, and it's called socialism. I don't want you to judge it yet. Don't be judgmental about socialism right now. Okay. But this is the political version of this idea. Group effort, everybody benefits equally. Now that does sound fair. It sounds fair when everybody benefits the same. So the idea of this philosophy is everybody works, everybody makes the effort, and so everybody benefits the same. Not a problem, right? What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Well, what could possibly go wrong is, the truth is, not everybody puts the same effort. Not everybody works the same, and not everybody puts the same effort in. Because people are diverse, and we're not even talking about racial, ethnic, social, or any of those things. We're not talking about that at the moment. Those things come into it. But because people are diverse, not everybody has the same health, the same skills, the same talents, the same likes, the same notions, the same personality. People are diverse for reasons of genetics and environment, location, geography, when they were born, age, all of those things. There is a diversity in humanity that is natural to the human condition, and that means that not everybody will, in fact, put the same amount of effort into everything. The effort and the work is not equal, and neither are they capable of it. Maybe for health reasons, or because it's not part of their skill sets, and so forth and so on. So the whole of this idea of justice depends upon the notion that everybody is going to contribute equally. Okay, so I need some room on the board. So everybody's going to contribute equally. So everybody should benefit equally. But the truth is that not everybody can contribute equally. Therefore, everybody does not, in the normal materialistic sense, in the way our world works, not everybody in fact benefits equally. And it is the disparity between the benefit that some people have and others enjoy that creates the problem of injustice in the minds of some. The outcomes are not equal. Now, how fair is it? How fair is it that some people benefit disproportionately to others? They seem to enjoy a greater fruit for their labor than others. Well, again, there's a disparity in effort or investment or the capacity for sacrifice in order to reap the benefits of their effort and so forth. There's all of that that's going on. And so when you have a group of people and you have a segment of society or a segment of that group who don't engage, that refuse to engage for whatever reasons, maybe stubbornly are stubbornly lazy, and yet they expect to benefit equally from the outcome of the group as a whole, we then get into a problem where we now have injustice. Now, the reason this is never talked about is because it's injustice of a different kind. When we talk about injustice where there is a lack of equal benefit, the whole world goes up in arms. That's not fair. But when there is an injustice of a disparity between effort and reward, the amount of effort versus the reward, when the reward is great, but it is confiscated in order to service those who refuse to put the effort in and are lazy, then this matter of the injustice of that is never raised in the secular world. But it is in the Christian worldview. Paul even raised it in 2 Thessalonians when he said, if you don't work, you don't eat. Because the church was carrying the water for a group of people that were idle and busybodies. And Paul said, just don't feed them. They'll soon come around. That's a difference in the way that the secular world looks at this issue of injustice. I hope that kind of makes sense to you. So, in a sense, we discover that the idea of social justice actually has a problem. There's a natural problem that there's a problem with the idea of social justice in the terms that we've described, all right? So leaving off all of the idea of talents and all the rest of it, we've discovered that if a person won't put the effort in but is has equal access to the benefits of the group, that too is unjust. And it means that there are people in the group that have to carry those who are not making the effort. and they are a drag. What happens then under those circumstances if there are enough people that do not engage and they affect the productivity of the whole group? What if the whole of the group, let's talk about American society, what if the whole of American society cannot reach its goals because there are not enough people engaging enough effort to reach those goals? You've got some that are, but you've got many who are not, and therefore the productivity of the group, the ability of the group to achieve and make progress is impaired, maybe even to the point where there is a deterioration in circumstances or productivity. What happens when that? Well, there are a number of examples of this. We have the problem with the car industry, with the fantastic in American car industry that collapsed under the weight of the fantastic deals that the CEOs were getting and that the unions were demanding for the workers with respect to retirement and all the rest of it. And the production could not keep pace with the demands for the benefits. Now, I'm not saying that there was laziness involved there. I'm just saying that this is an example of how something collapses in on itself when it's not realistic, when the benefits are not accrued according to the effort or the productivity. The productivity could not keep up. Even communism as a system collapsed under the weight of not being able to produce enough to service what was seen to be the utopian goals and benefits that communism anticipated for its people. Even in China, there had to be a hybrid system of capitalism that serviced socialism in order for Chinese society to advance in its standard of living. So we find out that this idea of justice, and I'm using those systems, by the way, as just examples, to underscore the idea that justice, in the common idea that everything should be fair with respect to outcomes, is not tenable in the practical and real world. It's great as a theory, but it doesn't work in the real world. It is impossible to guarantee equal outcomes and at the same time to be fair in the social justice system. Now, I want to talk about something that's going to be very difficult, and it's probably emotive, and it's going to sound political, and I don't want to. I want you to understand this is not a political evaluation. This is not a moral evaluation of the system. I just want to put forward an idea that we are batting around in American secular culture right now about a certain issue. And I want to talk about how we as Christians ought to approach. I'm going to use this as an example on how Christians can approach the secular world with an answer to this issue. It is often observed that American society is unfair, unjust, and unequal because of our history, because of our historical racism, because of slavery, and because of historical prejudice. Now, I want to say up front, now I'm not from America, I'm from the UK, and we have our own cultural problems over there too that are of a similar nature, but I'm going to say right now, knowing what I do know about American history and what I know about American prejudice and ethnic and racial tensions, which is probably very limited. But what I do know is this is not wrong. We as Americans have to acknowledge that our history that what we have been at one time, the struggles that we have had racially, ethnically, socially, and the prejudice that has been rampant in our society has caused a lot of the tension that we currently are dealing with. We are actually carrying the baggage right now for our history, and we have to acknowledge that. If we don't acknowledge that, there is no way forward. But one of the suggestions on the way forward is the idea that the offending group needs to compensate the offended group. Now, this is seen mainly in racial terms, of course, but the offending group that exists needs to compensate the offended group, the group that historically did the offending, needs to compensate the group that historically was offended by the unequal, unfair, and unjust treatment. The historical unfair, unjust, and unequal treatment. The idea that this is going to be principally a financial compensation is beside the point at the moment. But the problem that occurs with this is you are going to penalize a group that you're going to penalize the current group that did not do the offending, and you are going to compensate a group that were not offended historically. Now, this is the argument that is often raised. Well, I didn't do the offending. Therefore, why should I pay, or why should you compensate those who were not offended at my expense? Historically, we're speaking. There's something wrong with that argument. And what's wrong with that argument that Christians often don't recognize is that the group, the members of the group that were historically offended do, in reality, still suffer from certain consequences and ramifications of what happened historically. And that's something that we as Christians need to understand. This is such a thorny issue to deal with and so difficult to get around that most Christians have no idea what the next move ought to be. Because when you start penalizing a group for something it has not done to benefit or to compensate a group that may not have experienced the historical prejudice itself, then you create a sense of, and I hate to put it this way, but it's the truth, a sense of injustice, unfairness. And again, we run into a problem where, and this is what I'm trying to get at here, where the system appears to collapse in on itself because it then uses something that is unjust to create something that is supposed to be or appears to be just. And so now what we've done is we've simply changed and switched sides, and we have now offended a different group in order to compensate a group that was previously offended. Unless we're willing to talk about these things in these kinds of open terms, then we're never going to make progress. So what does the Christian do? What do Christian ethics say? How are we going to deal with this problem then of injustice? And how are we going to overcome the fact that some groups of people are suffering even now from the consequences of that historical injustice, and we don't know as a society how we're going to move forward? Can the church, does the Christian worldview have an answer to this question. And I think that the Christian worldview does have an answer to this question. How are we going to make progress? What is the suggestion that the Christian worldview needs to make to the world? What do we need to represent in order to overcome these issues? Now, I know some of these issues are going to be dealt with by public policy, and there's nothing we can do about that because unless we change the way we vote. But there's not a whole lot we can do about what they're going to do in Washington over some of these issues. But as Christians, we ought to be presenting an example of what is the right way to go about reconciling and reconstructing the relationships between diverse people and establishing justice in our society. And here is the question that I raised with a brother of mine, Dr. Kevin Robinson. In the talk about how do we achieve diversity in our churches, which was a question that has been raised in the context of pastors who are trying to lead churches in a diverse community, how do we achieve diversity in our churches? I've heard so many ideas and so many thoughts, and I've heard people talk about diversity in the sense that the church needs to aim at having diversity and go out and get diversity and pursue diversity, and Christians ought to be looking to establish diversity and all of that. But nobody ever said, how do we do this? Nobody ever gave an answer about how we can achieve this. And I asked my brother, Dr. Kevin Robinson, one day, how do we achieve this? What is the key to this? And twice he told me this. The first time it didn't register as well as it should have done. But the second time that he said it more recently, it made sense to me more than anything else I have heard in the public arena yet. Treat people like human beings. That's it. That's it. It's no more complicated than that. When he said it to me the second time, it registered more firmly in my spirit than before. Treat people like human beings. That's it. How do we approach this problem of diversity, of injustice, and of the struggles that we're having in our society? The Judeo-Christian way of doing this, and if you read the book of Acts, and if you look at what's going on in the early church and the way Paul speaks in his epistles about the community of the church and the diversity of the church and the need for unity in the church and the need for the love that we have for one another, and that fellowship principally depends upon us building one another up and edifying one another, you discover that this is the biblical answer to the problems that we're having in secular American society and culture right now. We ought to treat one another as human beings. That's it. Instead of treating one another as this group and this social designation, or this group of victims, or this group of advantaged people, and so forth and so on, we ought to be looking at one another, and as Christians, we need to be practicing this in our churches. We treat one another like human beings. We love one another, and this not only has to do with the racial diversity, but we need to be treating the homosexual as a person. We need to be treating the transgender person as a human being and showing them the love of Jesus. Let Jesus do the work that needs to be done in their lives. And yes, we're going to tell the truth, and yes, we're going to preach the gospel, and yes, we're going to represent the morality of the Word of God, but not in a way that devalues or destroys the humanity of that person. Not as a religious zealot, but as a deeply concerned Christian who loves people. We treat people like human beings. All right, that's going to be the end of the lesson. So I hope that you got that. We are looking at these three things then that cause the friction in the world today, in American culture in particular, and global culture generally. The problem with truth, the problem with judgmentalism, and the problem with justice and social justice. So we're looking at those three things. Now, having armed ourselves with an understanding of where the tension is coming from, we're now going to go forward and look at some of the specific issues and ask the question, how do we, from the Christian ethical and moral position, address some of these issues and deal with it in the context of our society and culture? God bless you. I hope this lesson's been helpful to you and that you will be able to take in some of these principles.